Okay, welcome to this revision video on the GCSE RS thematic topic, human rights. And this will be another 5-part video. In the first video, we'll look at the dignity of human life and the example of a particular person, Martin Luther King. In the second video, we'll look at censorship, freedom from religious expression, and religious extremism. In the third video, we'll look at prejudice and discrimination. In the fourth video, wealth and poverty. And in the last video, working against injustice. So first of all, some key vocabulary. So there's quite a lot of vocabulary in this topic. The first is censorship. Suppressing or limiting access to materials considered offensive or a threat to security, when the government or an authority denies people information or their right to free speech. Jesus said we should obey Caesar, meaning we should follow the law of the land. Discrimination, treating people differently because of their religion, sexuality, race, or gender. Christians believe that we should treat others as you would like to be treated, meaning we should treat everyone equally. Extremism, holding an aggressive political or religious view. Recently, extreme views have led to terrorist actions. However, Jesus taught that those who take up the sword will die by the sword, and therefore discouraged such actions. Human rights, the things that humans should expect to have or be able to do. For example, every person has the right to religious freedom and freedom of expression. Personal conviction, a strong opinion or belief based on a personal opinion or experience. For example, Martin Luther King Jr. believed that all human beings were equal. Prejudice, prejudging someone without any evidence. Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan to show how we shouldn't judge others, but instead we must love our neighbours. Relative poverty. Relative poverty is defined as by a country a person is in. For example, not having a television in British society might be considered relative poverty. It's poverty in relation to the rest of the country. Absolute poverty, when there's severe deprivation of basic needs, food, human rights. Currently about 1.2 billion people are living in absolute poverty in the world. And lastly, social justice, when there's fair distribution of wealth, opportunities, privileges within society. For example, Jesus said that the way to get to the kingdom of God was to give all you own to the poor and follow him. So in this unit, we'll need to ask some important questions. What rights do we have to simply because we are human? How do Christians support human rights? Should people always have the right to express their views? How do Christians work to tackle poverty? How should you always stand up for what to believe in? Are some forms of poverty worse than others? These are all core questions we'll look at now. So in our first topic, looking at Christian attitudes to human rights and social injustice. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights reflects the main principles of Christianity. In fact, the Catholic Church in particular, and many other Christians, had a great influence on its formulation. Christians believe all people are children of God and created in God's image. Therefore, the characteristics of God are reflected in all beings, which means that each human was born with worth and value. Human life should not be destroyed or mistreated. Genesis 1:27-28 says, "Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that we may rule over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the air, and over the livestock, and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image, we find here. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, so he created them. So it continues. In Christianity, each human is to be treated with love, or the Greek word agape. It's a great word to learn, meaning unconditional love, like a mother has for her children, or Jesus when he sacrificed his life on the cross for the sins of humanity. Agape is selfless, unconditional love, that you voluntarily accept suffering, inconvenience, discomfort, and even death for the benefit of another without expecting anything in return. Agape is following Jesus' example, and many Christian charities, you could argue, express agape. One such Christian charity is the Christian Aid, an organization set up in 1941, and they seek to eradicate poverty across the globe. They want to ensure that human rights are being protected of those that are most vulnerable. They campaign to fundraise and achieve their goals. They want all humans to live free and full lives. As Jesus said, life in all its fullness, John 10, verse 10, have come that you may have life and life in all its fullness. They seek to expose the scandal of poverty, to challenge and change structures and institutions that favour the rich and powerful over the poor and marginalised. Following Christian values and Jesus' example, Christian Aid show respect for all human life. And they have strap lines like, "We won't stop till poverty stops." Another organisation that works to bring greater human rights and equality to the world is the Salvation Army. And people who belong to the Salvation Army and Christian Aid hold strong personal convictions. A strong personal conviction is when a person believes or feels strongly about something. The Salvation Army is a Christian denomination like the Church of England or Roman Catholic Church, but they wear a uniform to symbolize fighting against injustice. They seek to make real differences in their communities. They seek to serve a suffering humanity. They fundraise to achieve their goals. They provide services to local communities, food drops, soup kitchens, to help those in need, to fight against social injustice, to fight for human rights, the right for food, the right for clothing, to seek to preserve and protect the environment because of both moral and biblical reasons. They believe in stewardship as part of that. Now, some Christians who would support these charities want to go even further, and this is called liberation theology. Liberation theology is built on the teachings and actions of Jesus. During Jesus' lifetime, his actions helped liberate or free people from injustice and unfair economic or political or social conditions. For people who follow liberation theology, Jesus is considered a freedom fighter. And this might actually mean physical fighting. Notice the picture in the top right here of Jesus painted from South America as a freedom fighter. And some Christians literally believed that you should fight for the poor. This is Camilo Torres in the top right. He said it's a mortal sin not to fight for the poor. Liberation theology is the Christian idea that God has the power to change situations in the world that are unjust. Some Christians have taken this to mean that it's right to stand up to governments that oppress their own people or to challenge them on their abuse of power. I'm reminded in Hong Kong how Christians played a big part in fighting against China and its takeover of Hong Kong recently, and some of the songs they were singing on the street were Christian hymns. Christians may take part in peaceful protests or actively take part in supporting those harmed by injustice. For example, people who are imprisoned for political reasons without trial. Some supporters of liberation theology have been killed for speaking out against injustice. Among them was Oscar Romero. Unlike Camilo Torres, Romero was a pacifist, but he believed in non-violent resistance. Romero was born in El Salvador in 1917. He became a priest. He was ordained in 1962, and he became Archbishop of El Salvador in 1977. He said, it is not God's will for some to have everything and others to have nothing. In the 1960s, there was a lot of crime and corruption in El Salvador. Some people were very wealthy, but many people were very poor. And after a close friend of Romero's was murdered, he started to speak out against the injustices and openly criticized the government. He held meetings which had been banned by the government. Protesters in the church became targets of violence. The government's slogans and propaganda included, "Be patriot, kill a priest." After many threats, on the 24th of March 1980, soldiers burst into his chapel and gunned down Romero while he was celebrating Mass. For Christians and for humanists, the Human Rights and Social Justice Declaration is really, really important. Created in 1948 after the Second World War, it includes 30 statements or articles or things that humans should expect to be able to have or to do. At the beginning, it says, all humans are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. Groups such as Amnesty International monitor situations where human rights are not being upheld. Amnesty was founded by a Christian, the vicar of St. Martin in the Fields, who, when he found out about terrible injustices happening, started writing letters, getting others to write letters. Many people in the world today still do not have their basic rights. Many agencies support people's entitlement to human rights. This is called social justice, a fair and just relation between the individual and society. Social justice is about breaking down barriers due to race, religion, advantages in society, maybe just bad luck. It involves governments and agencies working together to try and help developing countries to reduce the divide between the rich and the poor. The leader of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, said, circumstances such as where a person is born, their gender, ethnicity should never determine their outcome. Opportunities for quality education, healthcare, shelter, access to water, to freedom to live without being threatened or actual violence is what the Declaration of Human Rights is all about. It's all about social justice, which means promoting a fair and just society by challenging injustice and valuing diversity, where everyone has access to the provisions and opportunities and rights. And the exam board wants you to learn about a specific organization or person who fights to create social justice. And probably one of the best in terms of racial justice is Martin Luther King. How did he fight in general for human rights? What are human rights again? The moral rights that apply to all people at all times in all situations, regardless of gender, age, race, religion, religious belief, or age. Who was Martin Luther King? Well, importantly, he was a Christian. He was a Baptist minister who was studied in liberation, studied in acts of non-violence. It was part of his theological research to look at how religious people should take a stand against injustice. He campaigned after his doctoral studies peacefully for equal rights for black people, but he did not agree with violence. Following the influence of Gandhi and others, he believed in non-violent resistance, pacifism. He gave the famous I Have a Dream speech, which told his hopes for black and white people being treated equally. He organized boycotts, the Montgomery bus boycott being very famous. Black people stopped using buses until the law was changed so they didn't have to stand up so white people could sit down. Martin Luther King continues to inspire many Christians to fight against racism. He said, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. He was influenced in Jesus' teaching on agape, unconditional love. He campaigned non-violently and showed compassion to those who treated him so poorly and with injustice. He didn't want violence done to the perpetrators of injustice to black people. He organized protests and marches, speeches and sit-ins to get his non-violent message across. He believed what Jesus said about turning the other cheek and not to return hate for hate. He said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. He wanted to form a community. He said, we must learn to live together as brothers or perish as fools. Even though he's physically threatened, locked in jail, his house was bombed, King only used peaceful methods in his campaign for equality. King acted on his personal convictions that the law was wrong. He said, I have a dream that my 4 children one day will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. For King, his dream and motivation was that one day people would not be discriminated against because of their race. Now, there are other organizations and individuals you could look at. I think Martin Luther King is at the top of the list. But Amnesty is another interesting organization. founded by a vicar, a minister called Peter Benenson in 1960. Amnesty works worldwide to protect and campaign for people whose basic human rights have been denied. It uses non-violent methods to raise awareness and to protest against human rights abuses. It forms protest marches. It writes letters to governments campaigning for justice. It raises awareness through the media of people whose rights have been abused. It runs schools programs and events to educate about human rights abuses. And as an organization, it was given the Nobel Peace Prize in 1977 for their impact on the world, of their work on the world. Very important to Amnesty is the 30 Articles of the Human Rights Declaration. Very important is its belief that all humans, regardless of race, gender, social status, are entitled to these. These rights are applicable to all, at all times, to all, in all places, to all people, past, present, and future. Another person you could look at would be Malala, and we'll just do Malala as a third possibility. Martin Luther King, I think, would be a really good one. Amnesty and Malala. Who is Malala Yousafzai? Malala campaigned for human rights when she wanted to create a more socially just society in Afghanistan. She campaigned about the lack of education for girls in the Swat Valley in Pakistan, where she lived. She said, "I raise my voice not so I can shout, but so those without a voice can be heard. We can only succeed when half of us are being held back." The Taliban were a very powerful force where Malala lived and banned girls from going to school. For Malala, girls not being allowed an education went against Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to education. Malala knew that campaigning would put her life at risk, so the Taliban had issued death threats against her. When she was 11, she began writing a blog promoting education for girls. This led to her giving interviews to the media. On the afternoon of the 9th October 2012, she boarded her school bus when a gunman asked for her by name. He shot at Malala 3 times. One of the bullets hit her in the head. Miraculously, Malala survived despite severe injuries and continues to campaign for social justice. For Malala, her personal conviction or belief in the importance of education for girls drove her actions. For many people, their belief in the importance of dignity for every human being drives them to campaign against human rights abuses in order to create a just society. This is an important word you should know: personal conviction, something a person feels strongly or believes in. Many religious believers, Christians and Muslims alike, consider it important to campaign for issues of social justice as a response to the teachings of sacred texts. In the Bible, Jesus tells us to love our neighbour, and these sacred texts inspire believers today to make a stand against injustice around the world. Now, in this topic, you should also know about humanist attitudes to human rights and social injustice. Well, in general, humanists believe all life is important. All life should be valued and respected. Humanists seek to live good lives, but without religion, using reason and respect for others when making moral decisions. Humanists think every person should be treated with dignity and respect. All humans are worthy of equal consideration. Humanists support freedom of belief and expression, tolerance for all beliefs and ways of life, as long as they do not harm others. Humanists oppose racism, sexism, torture, unfair imprisonment, persecution because of their beliefs, inequalities of education. It's up to each individual to create a just society. Every human life deserves dignity. This is the only life we have. Humanists campaign for human rights and social justice. They helped found the United Nations and other organizations concerned with human rights. The National Humanist and Ethical Union has been very active in supporting the empowerment of oppressed people. So, of course, on the website, there are some super questions you can have a go at, practice questions. There are model essay answers you can read. There are Quizlets you can join and complete, and you could have a go at the topic test questions to go with this first of 5 videos.